Welcome to Real Grief, Real Healing with Mindy Corporon. I am your host, Mindy. A friend of mine told me in early 2018 that she saw a vision of me with a microphone in front of me. I laughed at the time and said, "I don't see any microphones in my future." Less than a year later, I was recording my first podcast on this show. I'm not going to say, "I hope you enjoy this podcast." My podcast is not truly meant to be enjoyed. Real grief, real healing is just that, real and raw. I provide you an opportunity to learn and share in the grief others are experiencing, and then we share how they are healing or perhaps not. Grief changes each of us in some way. Many of my guests have been encouraged to open new businesses, start foundations, and in general, work to make the world around us a better place. Grief is universal. How we decide to move onward, seeking healing, is individual. A significant part of my healing comes through the courageous kindness actions of others. As you listen to my podcasts, you will hear how you can give and receive courageous kindness too. Together, we are better.
Welcome to Real Grief, Real Healing with Mindy Corporon, taking a deep dive into the reality of the difficulty grief brings and offering insight into the healing available to each of us. Today, episode 31, I Can't See the Pain Inside You. And now your host, Mindy Corporon.
Hi friends, this is Mindy Corporon. Thank you so much for joining me today for Real Grief, Real Healing with Mindy Corporon. We're in the month of May, and the month of May is Mental Health Awareness Month. My last podcast distribution was in April. It was Saturday, April 17th, and it was a conversation and discussion with Kevin and Ann Timmons. It was very raw and deep. It was tearful. There were tearful moments for each of us. And if you have not yet listened to it, but now you're intrigued and you want to go listen to it, I want you to know it's about suicide. I had chosen to talk to Kevin, whom I've known for quite some time. I knew him prior to his son, Nick, taking his life. And because of May being Mental Health Awareness Month, he came to mind. I felt like my spirit said to me, that's who you want to talk to. So we had that interview, and that podcast dropped on April 17th. And now we're in May, and two things are colliding. I'm sure more are colliding than two, but two come to mind that I'm going to mention. Again, it's Mental Health Awareness Month, and Healing a Shattered Soul, my first published book, has a birth date of May 3rd. And while I am deeply gratified, that's probably the best way to say that, I am deeply gratified for having this story, my story, and several other people's story written and in print for you to read. It's also very bittersweet. It is a difficult book to read, and it's a joyful book to read. That's what I would like to tell you. I hope that you grab a copy, share a copy, buy a copy for a friend who is looking for their own path to healing. So as these two activities, these two events are colliding, I'm going to pull in for today's podcast right now, Chapter 14 from Healing a Shattered Soul. Chapter 14 is titled Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. And while you might be thinking that this chapter is about me and my own personal post-traumatic stress, it's not. This chapter is about my brother, Tony Corporon. I had the pleasure of creating a podcast with Tony in 2020. I will have a link to the podcast I created with Tony. He's my younger brother. That link will be in my show notes. And he talked then very vulnerably and openly about his day, April 13th, 2014, and then his dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. So without further ado, I'm going to read the chapter to you, chapter 14, titled Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, in the book, Healing a Shattered Soul. When fun and exciting experiences happen to us, we retell them over and over. The energy we receive from these moments propel us forward and onward in our river of life, free and flowing. Consider the high you feel when your favorite team wins an important game and you saw it happen. We want this memory to last, to be indelibly etched in our brains, and to provide us continuing joy for days, months, and years. This is why at reunions of all types, family, high school, college, sorority, and fraternity alike, we relive the personal and frequently shared moments of importance from our past. Reliving traumatic events is not the same. However, reliving traumatic experiences can be just as or important to our mental health. Talk therapy is an effective treatment and one of several promoted options for healing after a traumatic experience, per the U.S. Department for Veterans Affairs National Center for PTSD website. This chapter is dedicated to my younger brother, Tony Corporon. Thank you, Tony, for stepping into a position of care in the midst of our shared pain. The following is an annotated excerpt from my podcast, Real Grief, Real Healing with Mindy Corporon, distributed on July 18, 2020, titled, Emotional Security is Mental Health Care. This is when I asked Tony to share with me his experience on Sunday, April 13th, 2014. My podcast recordings typically begin the same way each time. Dave Croft, my producer, provided by the Experience of the Soul podcast channel, has sent me and my guest a link to join him for recording. I am sitting in my hopefully noise-free closet as I click the link. On May 13th, 2020, I found Dave already in the session talking with Tony, my guest for this recording. They were chit-chatting about our current dilemma with the COVID-19 pandemic and how cramped Tony was sitting in his closet, sitting exactly where I had asked him to be during his recording. Dave and I found that situating myself and my guests in our closets, filled with clothes, shoes, potentially a bed cover and pillows, makes for a wonderful makeshift studio. I had asked Tony to be my guest for the purpose of recording his recollection of Sunday, April 13th, 2014, the day our father and my son, his nephew, were murdered. If you could, for a second or two, consider a tornado. Being from Oklahoma, this came to me as an easy example. Essentially, we were all thrown into an F5 tornado for a period of about 2 hours. When the eye of the storm passed, we were left with life-altering damage. Over the past 6 years, I have gleaned some of the details of Tony's experience as compared to mine. However, he wasn't the person in our family to inform me of the lingering effects he was experiencing after this horrific day. Nearly 2 years after the murders, my mom shared with me the fact that Tony had sought counseling for depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. A wave of guilt washed over me. Images from our tragic day were not only mine, they were shared. Perhaps we didn't see, hear, or feel the same things, but we were both experiencing the lasting effects of trauma. Tony begins his explanation of the day in this way. Sunday morning was a normal morning for us. His wife Dana informed him that she would be taking their 2 children for Easter bunny photos with our mom. It was interesting hearing Tony say that the morning was normal and relaying the information about Easter bunny photos in the same sentence. Clearly, taking Easter bunny photos is not part of a normal day. Yet during Easter season, we grew up with this almost mandatory expectation of bunny photos. Tony continued, Our mom, Melinda, really likes the Easter pictures, and so we were playing the good family and getting the kids all dolled up to go. It was also the day before my birthday. Again, the day before his own birthday, Tony casually calls this morning normal for them. Perhaps growing up in the Midwest and being fed Methodist and Presbyterian doctrine took us on a path that said, no matter what happens to you, it is normal. So much like my father and mother's relationship, Tony asked Dana what he needed to do to help her for the day. Dana is much more independent than my mother. I expect an entire generation of women who are a few years older than me, all the way to Dana, who is 10 years my junior, would attest to being more independent than their mothers and mothers-in-law. She was gainfully employed in a full-time corporate position with a bank and raising 2 children. Dana easily and gently responded to Tony, just do your thing today. At the time, it seemed innocuous, of course. Tony continues, So I went to the gym and was on a treadmill at 1 o'clock or thereabouts, maybe 5 after. I got a call on my phone from Lynn Lowson, your husband. Each person Lynn phoned, my mother, older brother Will, and younger brother Tony, told me that Lynn was yelling his comments into the phone, which startled each of them when they answered. Lynn yelled something about Popeye's shot. Dad went by any number of names, Doc, Bill, and most recently Popeye, Tony said. Popeye was the name Reet had chosen for our father, his grandfather. In fact, Reet named Popeye before he called me Mom. I was only jealous for a short time. Tony continues. Lynn said there's been a shooting. Popeye's been shot. We don't know how bad. You need to get to the Jewish Community Center. I was taken aback when I heard that this was how Lynn presented the message to Tony and presumably to my mother as well. I knew my father was dead, and I had shared this with Lynn. Immediately, I felt he didn't trust me. Why had he not shared the same message with them? Lynn has since surmised he hoped I was wrong about Dad's death. He said that I sounded so frantic that he thought I could be wrong. Lynn is correct. I was frantic when I phoned him. He was the first phone call I made after I found them in the parking lot with my hand shaking so violently that I couldn't hold the phone that was just handed to me. My mind was clear, though. I knew what I saw. In fact, I carefully chose the words, Dad has been shot and is dead, rather than describe how I knew he was dead. And I have never, nor will I ever, explain how my father looked when I found his body, injured so badly from the gunshot wound that took his life. The thought of not being trusted caused me an uncomfortable feeling, even as I consider it today. I have to process this feeling each time my family members explain what they heard Lynn say to them. I also have to forgive. So much forgiveness is needed for myself in each small, seemingly inoffensive step of the day. Tony knew that our father had at least one firearm in his truck. A thought flashed through his mind as he was running from the gym to his car that any gunshots could have been from his own legally owned firearm. I really rushed out of the gym, grabbed my stuff, and ran for my car. I probably exercised more between the locker room and my car than I actually did at the gym, Tony shared. I needed to find out what was going on. Tony considered the location of his own family members. I knew that Dana was with Mom having Easter pictures taken. My husband, Lynn, had mostly followed my instructions to call my mom immediately about the shooting at the Jewish Community Center. Between the time of Tony driving to the photo studio where his wife and children were, my mother had received the call from Lynn. After hearing from Lynn about a shooting at the Jewish Community Center, my mom left the photo studio and drove the half-mile to the Jewish Community Center, leaving Tony's wife and children. Tony continued, I went to pick Dana and the kids up from the studio, and I still didn't know what was going on. I turned on the news, to see if there'd been any reports. I was driving and not really focused on driving. I was trying to get a hold of my family to find out if there was more going on. What was really happening? It was frustrating to not have a clue. I got to the photo studio and went inside. Finding Dana in the photo studio, she knew they needed to leave right away. We drove from the photo studio to the Jewish Community Center, which luckily was just about a half-mile away. Tony and Dana were with their 2 young children in the car, arrived at the Jewish Community Center. It had already been blocked off by police. Tony continued. Specifically, there was a young lady highway patrol officer who was blocking the entrance that I was trying to access at the Jewish Community Center. I remember stopping and letting the woman know that I was a family member and was clear that I needed to get past the barricades they were placing. I was trying really hard to be calm and wanting her to understand the importance of letting me through without me saying, my father has been shot, because we had my kids in the car, and at the time they were 7 and 5. Tony did not convince the highway patrol officer that he should be allowed to drive onto the campus. He realized he would be better off on his own with no vehicle or young children to contend with. In conversation with his wife, Dana, Tony said he would call her later and let her know what had happened as he was exiting his car. It was at this point when the highway patrol officer stated, "You can't stay here." The deep concern and fear of what had transpired on the campus that led Lynn to call him and that led my mom to hurriedly leave for the same Jewish Community Center campus was boiling over in Tony's emotions. He blurted out, "Yes, I can, because that's my father and that's my nephew who's been shot." Tony continues with his remembrance of that moment in time. My kids heard what I said about Reet being shot and about their Popeye, their grandfather, being shot. I did not want my children to hear this in that way. They didn't know what was going on. They knew it was important. They knew this was an emergency, but they didn't know what had happened yet. And I had to insist in front of a police officer that it was my family that was in there. One of my biggest regrets is not keeping my cool during that moment. My kids heard from me that their grandfather was shot, and I was stepping out of the car, seemingly into the same space as where the crime had taken place. I was leaving them and their mom after just yelling at a police officer. Andrew and Katie knew that Reet was with Popeye. They knew, as we all did, that Reet had an important audition and that Popeye was taking him. It was a scary moment. Tony has walked through the same scenario so many times in his mind, alone and with professional care, working to forgive himself for his actions and words during a tumultuous time. With Tony now out of his car, Dana took the driver's seat and began to back their car away. Standing next to the highway patrol officer, in a deluge of rain, Tony never truly received clearance that he could go on the property. Of course, there was a lot of chaos, and the pouring rain helped to cover him as he ran to the east side entrance of the building. Tony continued. I got inside from the east, not seeing the other side of the building, the crime scene. I found you, Mindy. You were distraught and in shock. You were very quiet, and you had kind of gone into yourself. Mom felt sick and had to go to the restroom, so we followed her, you and I, into the women's restroom. My anger boiled over. I knew now that Dad had died from a gunshot. You informed me that Reet was seriously injured and had been taken in an ambulance, but we didn't know which hospital. I had to get my anger out and used a bathroom stall as a punching bag. We are certain the Jewish Community Center forgave him for breaking one of the bathroom stall doors in the women's restroom that day. As Tony, Mom, and I left the women's restroom, we saw Lucas running towards us in the hallway with Lynn behind him. My 12-year-old baby boy had terror, sheer terror, on his face. I wish I could tell you exactly what happened next, but like some of the other aspects of this horrific day, I have to rely on the statements of others to assist me in piecing together the events. Undoubtedly, we embraced. I embraced Lucas. Lynn joined us. Tony and Mom joined in the full embrace. We needed one another. Our minds were racing and our hearts were fearful. I stopped our interview for a few minutes, allowing each of us to breathe. Reliving the memory of racing through the parking lot, visualizing the hallway, the restroom, Lucas's face, and that of my mother, Lynn, and me was a lot. It was time for a pause. Tony recalls, as do I, that we stayed at the Jewish Community Center for a long time. It felt like forever and may have only been about 30 minutes, even from the time he arrived. It took longer than it should have for the police to inform us of where the ambulance had taken Reet. Reet didn't have any identification on him, and since most homicides in our county involve family members, one or more of us were actually thought to be potential suspects in the murder. This thought lasted for only a short time in the scheme of the day because the shooter murdered Terry Lamano at the Village Shalom and then gave himself up in the parking lot of a nearby elementary school. Our interview begins again with Tony explaining his memory of our time in the hospital. We went to the hospital and we were in a very small waiting room, the room you never want to be in. The doctor with the long gray hair came in and told us that Reet had died. His heart had stopped in the ambulance and they could not restart his heart. That was a very cold moment. I felt shivers. I felt any range of emotions that were heightened and certainly a significant sadness flowed over me. Tony continued. The doctor with the ponytail allowed us a moment to grieve. Maybe he even left and came back to the room. They needed someone to identify the body. I heard the doctor say, "He is a young man that didn't have any identification on him. We cannot identify him as who you say he is. We need someone to identify the body." The ponytailed doctor has a name. None of us knew it at the time, and I didn't try to learn his name either. Not out of anger, but out of sheer determination to not feel what I felt when he shared the news with us that my oldest child had also lost his life. Don Fishman, MD, MBA, has been a practicing physician since 1988. He is an experienced board-certified general surgeon with specialized expertise in trauma and surgical critical care. He currently serves as a trauma medical director and surgical intensivist for Overland Park Regional Medical Center. Dr. Fishman is a diplomat of the American Board of Surgery and certified by the American Board of Surgery in critical care medicine. In addition to his extensive patient care experience, Dr. Fishman also served as an instructor at various medical teaching facilities in Chicago. Dr. Fishman also has a master's degree in business administration from Keller Graduate School of Business. His short biography presented here was retrieved from the HCA Overland Park Regional Medical Center website. Ironically, I met Dr. Fishman 1 year later face-to-face as a guest speaker for Midwest Transplant Network. Our family has always valued the importance of organ and tissue donation. Because Reet was able to be a tissue and ligament donor at his death, we were asked to present our personal story on several occasions for the benefit of raising awareness from the perspective of the donor family. In May 2015, I stepped back into the Overland Park Regional Medical Center for the first time since I learned the news that Reet had not survived the gunshot wound to his head. Families were gathering and sitting in metal chairs lined up theater style. A light brown wooden podium stood alone with a microphone set atop waiting for a presenter. who I thought to be organizers of the event, milled about talking amongst themselves and with people who looked to be medical personnel. While Midwest Transplant Network had invited me to speak, I wasn't sure of the roles everyone else would play. My role was to present our story of deciding to procure tissue and ligaments from Reed's deceased body, why we chose to do so, and how this affected our family. As I contemplated how I would tell my story without crying through the entire message, I saw him. Every time I speak about the exact moment that I heard the young man who was brought in with the gunshot wound did not survive, I see Dr. Fishman of Jewish faith speaking these words. Now I see him in person, standing only 10 feet away and in conversation with others. I didn't feel exactly the same sudden shock I felt when I shook the hand of firefighter Dan Stringfield. Now I felt a flutter in my stomach about speaking to Dr. Fishman. Unsure of what to say, but brave enough to walk toward him, I stood up on my already shaking legs and found myself standing next to him before determining how I would introduce myself. There was no need to introduce myself. Dr. Fishman had been part of the committee who asked me to be present. He was thankful I had accepted the invitation to speak and was expecting me. I have no quotes to share about our conversation because my brain was so careful to protect itself and my soul from further potential damage. I chatted and listened, yet recall next to nothing of our conversation other than feeling he had been the best person to receive Reed that day. Dr. Fishman was compassionately apologetic that they had lost their patient, my son. His team tried multiple times to coax Reed's heart to beat. The damage was too significant. I knew this already. I live it every day. In my podcast interview with Tony, he went on to say, after the doctor said they needed someone to identify the body, Mindy, you immediately said, I'll go. I knew somehow, some way, that you did not need to see your son again in such a state. I mean, you'd already seen him at the Jewish Community Center. I told you that I would identify Reed so that you did not have to do that. I went back with the doctors into the emergency room where Reed lay, and I identified Reed's body. Because we were sitting in our separate closets, miles apart, the tension I felt on my side of the computer could have been all my own. Realizing I had most likely never thanked Tony for lifting this task from my shoulders, I responded with, thank you. Even after 1 year of sinking into depression and feeling the effects of PTSD, and 1 more year of careful work with a counselor, Tony did not hesitate with his response, you're welcome. Continuing to fill voids in the spaces that were fuzzy in my brain, or those that I might not realize had taken place, I asked Tony to provide me with the details of his involvement at the hospital after he identified Reed's body. Tony proceeds with, in any heightened public emergency or disaster, there is a certain level of public relations that needs to be managed. Tony wanted to be helpful and needed to be engaged. The best way I saw to do that was to allow you, Mom, Lynn, and Lucas to grieve with one another while I made myself available to the detectives from the scene of the crime. I did the first interview with the detectives who had arrived on the scene. I also met with the hospital public relations team who were beginning to field calls from local news media about the shooting and requesting information about the victim. Initially, this was my role. Isn't it interesting how he found a role for himself in the middle of the storm? Like my father and the Eagle Scout that Tony is, he found the work that needed to be done. Even as a griever, Tony provided assistance where and when it was needed out of the desire to care for his family and stabilize himself. Both of these are valuable traits to have when a shit show crisis appears during your typically normal day. Returning from his role as intermediary for our family, he found that we had been relocated to a larger room to accommodate a growing number of friends and family. Friends, I'm going to pause there and let you know the final words in this chapter from my brother Tony. Tony's final words for my podcast listeners and you are, I'm glad that I was able to share this, and I hope that other men, especially who feel trauma in their lives, recognize that it's not a sign of weakness to admit that you need some assistance to find yourself. If you have suffered from trauma of any type and think you might have post-traumatic stress disorder, please continue reading below for a clear definition and options for care. And then in my chapter, I list several options from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, their website on post-traumatic stress disorder. As we look at May for several things, it may be graduation for someone in your family or maybe yourself. It certainly is going to host Mother's Day. And on a personal note, it's going to host my husband's birthday, the birthday of my book, and my son Reet's birthday, and Mother's Day. I have a lot to think about in the month of May. What we all should be thinking about collectively is mental health awareness. Thank you for joining me today on Real Grief, Real Healing. If you'd like to hear more, if you'd like to read more, please buy Healing a Shattered Soul and find your pathway to healing. Thank you. Friends, thanks so much for joining me today for this podcast of Real Grief, Real Healing with Mindy Corporon. If you want to dive deeper into how you might heal yourself or a friend, please pick up a copy of my book, Healing a Shattered Soul. Published on May 3rd, 2021, you can find my memoir anywhere books are sold. You will also find me in social media channels as Mindy Corporon. Take time to help yourself heal, accepting courageous kindness. Take time to heal another by giving courageous kindness. Together, we are better.
Real Grief, Real Healing is copyright 2021 to 2022, Mindy Corporon, all rights reserved. Our theme music is composed by Dave Croft and used with permission. This podcast is a production of 818 Studios.